She begged for water in the desert. Human Mercenary gave last Canteen without hesitation. Kane Walker had 28 hours of desert left to cross, a bullet wound leaking through his shoulder bandage, and one Canteen. Half full, maybe less. He saw her from 100 meters out. A small figure collapsed against a rock formation, crystalline skin catching the brutal sunlight of Aridus IV like fractured glass. Solarian, a child. Her skin, normally radiant with inner light, was cracked and fading to a sickly gray. Every instinct screamed at him to keep walking. He was a dead man if he stopped. The Cray Syndicate had gunships hunting him after the extraction job went sideways, and they didn't forgive witnesses. The smart play was to save his water, make the crossing, disappear into the port cities. He kept walking. 3 steps. 5. Please. Her voice was barely a whisper, carried on the scorching wind. In broken Terran standard. Water, please. Kane stopped. He stood there swaying slightly from blood loss and heat, staring at the shimmering horizon where safety waited. 28 hours. The math was simple. Share the water and they both die. Keep it, and maybe he makes it. He looked back at the child. Her hand was outstretched, trembling. Her eyes, those luminous Solarian eyes, were dimming like dying stars. Damn it. Kane turned around and stumbled to her, his boots kicking up clouds of red sand. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the spike of agony in his shoulder, and uncapped the canteen. Easy, kid, nice and slow. He tipped the canteen to her cracked lips, and she drank in desperate gulps. He poured the water over her crystalline skin, watching the cracks begin to seal, the gray fading back to a soft amber glow. She coughed, gasped, and her eyes focused on him with sudden clarity. More, she whispered. Kane looked at the canteen. Quarter full now. He poured the rest over her, every last drop, until the canteen ran dry and she was breathing steadily, color returning to her face. He tossed the empty canteen aside and sat back on his heels, staring at the desert that would probably kill him now. What's your name, kid? Reva. Her voice was stronger. I was with my mother, the convoy. There was a storm, but it wasn't natural. It came from machines. We were attacked. Kane's combat instincts, dulled by exhaustion, suddenly sharpened. Attacked? By who? I don't know. I ran, got separated. She tried to sit up, winced. My mother is Ambassador Solara. She'll be looking for me. Ambassador? Kane closed his eyes. Of course. He'd just saved the daughter of one of the most powerful Solarians in the hegemony, which meant whoever attacked that convoy had resources, planning, and a reason to want a diplomat's child dead. All right, Reva, let's get you out of the sun. He fashioned a shelter using his tarp in the rock formation, angling it against the afternoon glare. His shoulder throbbed with every movement, fresh blood seeping through the bandage. Reva watched him with wide eyes as he worked, her small hands clutching the fabric of his jacket. Why did you help me? She asked. You're hurt. You needed that water. Kane secured the last corner of the tarp and settled into the shade beside her. Guess I'm bad at math. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of orange and crimson, Kane used old Ranger survival tricks, condensation traps fashioned from scraps of plastic, shallow holes dug where the sand was darker, searching for trace moisture. It wasn't much. It wouldn't save them if help didn't come. But Reva was alive. That counted for something. Night fell fast on Aridus IV, the temperature plummeting from scorching to freezing in minutes. Kane wrapped Reva in his jacket, his own body shivering as he kept watch, pulse pistol in hand, eyes scanning the darkness for threats. Then he saw them, lights in the distance, moving fast, hover transports, multiple signatures. Kane tensed, raising his weapon. If it was the Syndicate, he'd make his last stand here. At least the kid would have a chance to run. But the transports bore Solarian diplomatic markings, sleek and official. They descended in a coordinated pattern, kicking up clouds of sand and bathing the makeshift camp in harsh floodlights. The lead transport's hatch hissed open, and she stepped out. Ambassador Solara was tall, even for a Solarian, her crystalline skin glowing with an inner radiance that made the floodlights seem dim. She wore formal robes that shimmered like liquid mercury, but her face was pure maternal terror, barely held in check by diplomatic training. Riva! The child scrambled out from under the tarp and ran. Solara caught her, dropping to her knees in the sand, holding her daughter with a desperation that transcended species. Solarian guards fanned out, weapons raised, scanning for threats. Solara's eyes found Kane over Riva's shoulder. He was still kneeling in the sand, blood-soaked and half-frozen, his empty canteen lying beside him like an accusation. You, Solara said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved her. Kane tried to stand, swayed, and one of the guards caught him. Just happened to be passing through. Solara stood, still holding Riva, and approached him. Her eyes, brilliant and sharp, took in the wound, the empty canteen, the makeshift shelter. Her expression shifted from relief to something else. Understanding, recognition of what his choice had cost. You gave her your water, all of it. In the deep desert, Kane shrugged with his good shoulder. She needed it more. That water was your life. Yeah, well, bad at math. Remember? Solara's gaze held his for a long moment. Then she turned to her guards. Get him medical attention. Now. She looked back at Kane, and her voice dropped to something more intimate, more personal. We need to talk, Mr. Walker. Kane Walker. Mr. Walker, my daughter's alive because of you, but she was nearly killed because someone orchestrated an attack on my convoy, an artificial sandstorm, surgical and deliberate, designed to separate and eliminate targets. Her eyes hardened. This was an assassination attempt, and you, a human mercenary with no political ties, just saved the primary target at potentially fatal cost to yourself. Kane felt the weight of where this was going. I'm just passing through, Ambassador, not looking for trouble. Trouble has already found you, Mr. Walker, and more importantly, she glanced down at Riva, who was still clinging to her, but watching Kane with something like adoration. You found us. The treaty negotiations between the Solarian hegemony and the Terran coalition begin in 3 days. Someone wants them to fail badly enough to kill a child. I need someone I can trust. Someone with no agenda except the one I watched him demonstrate in the desert. She stepped closer, and Kane could feel the warmth radiating from her crystalline skin, a stark contrast to the freezing desert night. I'm offering you full pardons for whatever you're running from, payment that will set you up for life, and a position as Riva's personal protector for the duration of the summit. You'll have my full authority and resources. Her voice softened. You've already proven you'll give everything to keep her safe. I'm asking you to do it again, officially. Kane looked at Riva, who smiled at him, a child's smile, innocent and trusting. Then at Solara, whose desperation was masked by diplomatic poise, but burned in her eyes like a sun. He thought about the empty canteen, the 28 hours of desert he'd sacrificed, the bullet wound in his shoulder and the syndicate contract on his head. He thought about the moment he'd turned around, when every logical instinct told him to keep walking. When do we leave? Kane said. The hover transport whisked them away from the desolate cold of the desert night and into the sprawling, fortified heart of Arida's city. The diplomatic compound was less a building and more a self-contained fortress of gleaming chrome and crystalline architecture, a stark island of order in a world of sand and survival. Inside, Solara brought him to a private briefing room. The air was cool, the lights soft. Riva, cleaned and dressed in fresh robes, refused to leave his side, her small hand clutching his. The Solarian Human Accords, Solara began, her voice low and urgent as a medical droid tended to Kane's shoulder, are designed to end a century of Cold War. Decades of proxy conflicts, espionage, and border skirmishes have made a lot of people very rich. She gestured to a holographic display. A symbol appeared, a jagged shard of black rock. The Obsidian Syndicate. They're war profiteers, arms dealers who've supplied both sides. Peace is bad for business. The attack on my convoy, the artificial sandstorm, it was their doing. A surgical strike to kill Riva. Kane's blood ran cold. He looked down at the child whose head now rested against his leg. Killing her would be more than a personal tragedy, Solara continued. her voice catching for a fraction of a second. It would shatter my ability to lead the delegation. The talks would collapse. The syndicate would get their war, and the galaxy would burn. Her gaze met his. That is the job, Mr. Walker. You are not just guarding a child. You are guarding the last best chance for peace. Later, she introduced him to her formal security team. The leader was Captain Thane, a tall, severe-looking Solarian whose crystalline skin seemed colder, sharper than Solara's. His eyes raked over Kane's worn gear and scruffy appearance with undisguised contempt. Ambassador, Thane said, his voice a low rumble, with all due respect, relying on human mercenary scum is a security risk we cannot afford. Your team failed to prevent the attack, Captain, Solara countered, her tone like ice. Mr. Walker succeeded in saving my daughter. His status is irrelevant. He answers only to me. Thane's jaw tightened, but he gave a stiff, formal bow. The message was clear. Kane was an outsider, an enemy in their midst. But Riva didn't see a mercenary. As the guards tried to lead her to her own quarters, she clung to Kane's hand, her small voice unwavering. No, I stay with my desert guardian. The title hung in the air. Kane felt the weight of it, a responsibility heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. He watched as Solara knelt down, her fierce maternal protectiveness a palpable force, her voice softening as she spoke to her daughter. In that moment, Kane saw a mirror of the raw, primal instinct that had made him turn back in the desert. It wasn't just a job anymore. Something else was stirring, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. A purpose. The opulence of the diplomatic compound was a cage of a different kind. Kane settled into his role, a ghost in polished halls, his worn combat boots a constant offense to the gleaming floors. He was a creature of dust and desperation, now tasked with navigating sterile corridors and political smiles. He felt Thane's eyes on him constantly, a cold, crystalline glare that promised trouble. That evening, Solara summoned him to her private quarters. The room was vast and minimalist, overlooking the city's glittering spires. Riva was asleep in an adjoining chamber. Your wound is still untreated, Solara stated, not asked. She gestured to a chair. On a small table sat a medical kit, its contents both alien and familiar. He sat, stripping off his shirt. The makeshift bandage he'd applied was soaked through. Solara approached, her movements precise. He braced for the sting of antiseptic, the cold probe of a medical tool. Instead, he felt her fingers brush against his skin. It was like being touched by warm sunlight. Solarian skin naturally conducted heat, a low, steady radiance that seeped past his defenses. Her touch was clinical, yet devastatingly intimate. As she cleaned the wound, her focus was absolute, but Kane felt the air crackle with unspoken questions. My aides gave me your file, she said softly, her eyes never leaving her work. What they could find, at least. It says you were a decorated Terran Ranger, one of the best. How does a man like that become this? The word mercenary hung unsaid between them. The old wound, the one deeper than his shoulder, tore open. He stared at the far wall, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Peacekeeping mission on Cygnus X-1. My unit was ambushed, syndicate-backed insurgents. He paused, the memory of physical weight. I was the sole survivor. Command said I abandoned my post. Dishonorably discharged. Her hand stilled for a second. And did you? There were children, Kane said, his voice raspy. Civilian kids caught in the crossfire. I broke protocol to get them out. By the time I got back, my unit was gone. He didn't need to say more. The ruin of his name, the years of running, it was all there in the silence. Solara finished dressing the wound, her touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. My mate, she said, her voice barely a whisper, was killed in the Cygnus conflict. Kane's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. The same war, the same furnace that had forged his guilt had also forged her grief. In that moment, they were no longer an ambassador and a mercenary. They were two survivors, two parents bound by a shared history of loss. An invisible, unbreakable line was drawn between them. Later, before he took up his post outside her door for the night, Riva found him. She held up her small hand, fingers spread. This means guardian, she whispered, carefully folding his fingers into the same shape. It was a Solarian hand sign, an ancient ritual of bonding. As he looked at the small girl patiently teaching him her people's silent language of trust, he felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. He wasn't just guarding a client, he was guarding a child. Her child. The garden ceremony was a fragile illusion of peace. Solarians in flowing silks mingled with human dignitaries in stiff uniforms, their laughter echoing among crystalline sculptures that refracted the twin suns into 1,000 rainbows. But Kane saw only angles and exposures. Every balcony was a potential sniper's nest. Every service drone a possible bomb. He stood apart from the main security detail, his gaze sweeping the rooftops, ignoring Thane's disapproving stare. He was a wolf in a gilded cage, and his fur was standing on end. Riva, holding her mother's hand, pointed at a particularly brilliant sculpture of a star sailor. "Look, Mama, it's so pretty." That's when Kane saw it. A flicker of movement, a glint of light where there should be none, high up on the administrative spire. Time didn't slow down. It fractured. Before the sound even registered, before the first scream, Kane's body was already moving. "Get down!" he roared, launching himself forward. He hit Riva like a linebacker, his body absorbing the impact as he twisted, pulling her with him behind the thick base of a granite fountain. A millisecond later, a high-energy whine tore through the air where she had been standing. The crystalline star sailor exploded into a cloud of glittering dust. Another shot, and then a third, chewed through the air, sending shards of stone flying. Panic erupted. Solara was already on the ground, shielding her head. Thane's guards were shouting, forming a perimeter. But they were reacting. Kane was acting. His eyes were locked on the spire. He had the shot trajectory. He knew the location. He met Solara's terrified gaze. "Stay here. Don't move." Then he was gone, a blur of motion weaving through the panicked crowd. His old ranger training flooded his senses, silencing the noise, turning the world into a series of obstacles and pathways. He vaulted a decorative hedge, scaled a maintenance ladder, and kicked open a service hatch to the upper levels. He moved through the sterile corridors with a lethal silence, his pistol drawn. He burst onto the rooftop terrace. The assassin was there, a human already packing his rifle. He spun, bringing a pulse pistol up, but Kane was faster. He didn't fire. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his arms swinging like a piston, knocking the gun away. The fight was short and brutal. A block, a parry, a sickening crack as Kane broke the man's arm. He slammed the mercenary against the parapet, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Who hired you?" Kane snarled, his face inches from the assassin's. The man coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Go to hell." "You first," Kane growled, applying pressure. "Talk, or I'll drop you 6 stories." The assassin's eyes widened in pain and fear. "Don't know a name. A dead drop. In the city," he rasped. "Paid in untraceable syndicate credits. The intel on the ceremony schedule. It came from inside." Footsteps thundered onto the roof. Captain Thane and his team arrived, weapons raised. They froze, seeing Kane holding the dying mercenary. The assassin gave a final, gurgling laugh. "He's in your house, Ambassador," he whispered, and then his eyes went vacant. The revelation hung in the air, colder than the desert night. A traitor. Not just syndicate, but someone on the inside. Solara's security team was compromised. That night, the compound was a fortress on lockdown. But Riva's screams cut through the silence, nightmares tearing her from sleep. She wouldn't calm down, wouldn't let her mother leave her side, until Solara finally asked Kane. He didn't hesitate. He pulled a chair to the outside of Riva's bedroom door and sat, his pistol resting on his thigh. He was no longer just a bodyguard. He was the only wall she had left, a lone guardian against the enemies within. The late-night quiet of Solara's private office was a world away from the chaos in the garden. The only sounds were the hum of the secure server and their own hushed voices, a low murmur in the dark. Piles of personnel files lay on the table between them, and security footage played out on a holographic display, a silent ballet of ghosts moving through the compound. Kane pointed at a time code, his finger hovering over the screen. There, the gardener. He looks toward the spire 2 seconds before the first shot. Too clean. Solara leaned closer, her shoulder almost brushing his. Her scent, something like warm amber and desert rain, filled the small space between them. I've known him for 5 years, she said, her voice strained. He helped Rava plant her first moon petal seeds. Everyone's a friend until they're not, Kane said, his tone flat but not unkind. They worked for hours, their shared purpose, creating an intimacy that felt more dangerous than any assassin's bullet. He saw the exhaustion etched around her golden eyes, the immense weight she carried not just as a mother, but as the representative of her entire species. She saw the relentless focus in him, the way his military discipline was a shield for something deeper, something wounded. Finally, she broke the silence. I haven't allowed myself this, she said, gesturing vaguely at the space between them, to rely on anyone. Since my mate was killed, duty has been my shield. It's easier than feeling. Kane stopped scrolling through the files. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he let his own shield down. I know what you mean, he confessed, his voice rough. After my unit, I thought it was better to be alone. I wasn't running from a fight. I was running from having anything left to lose. As he spoke, he swiped to the next file on a datapad. Her hand moved to do the same, and their fingers brushed. For a flicker of a second, Solara's regal composure shattered. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her golden eyes widened as she felt it through her skin. Not a thought, but a raw, unfiltered wave of his soul. The crushing guilt of a soul survivor. The profound loneliness of a man adrift. And beneath it all, a fierce, desperate loyalty he now felt for her and for Riva. It was overwhelming, a truth more powerful than any words. She snatched her hand back as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air crackled with the unspoken admission. She was conflicted, her duty, her position, the memory of her mate. But the connection was undeniable. They didn't speak of it. They couldn't. Instead, they returned to the files, the professional mask back in place. But everything had changed. By the time the first sun began to rise, they had narrowed the list of traitors to 3 names with suspicious off-world communications. The investigation consumed their nights, but the days belonged to Riva. In the compound's training yard, Kane showed her how to track, how to listen to the wind, how to use shadows for cover. It was a game to her, but a necessary lesson to him. She was a quick study, her crystalline eyes bright with focus. One afternoon, after she successfully tracked him through the gardens, she threw her arms around his waist, her small frame radiating warmth. "You're my desert guardian," she declared, her voice full of childish certainty. The simple words hit Kane harder than any bullet. Sharing a meal with her and Solara, watching Riva mimic his serious expression as she stood guard over her plate, these small moments of domestic peace showed him exactly what he'd been missing. It wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a purpose. It was a family. The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. A classic misdirection. Kane and Solara would announce a last-minute, high-security trip for Reva to a state function. But they would feed 3 different versions of the itinerary, one to each of their 3 suspects. One version mentioned a route through the upper sky lanes, another through the mag tunnels, and the third, given to a junior logistics officer, detailed a ground-level convoy. Then they would wait to see which location was hit. The tension in the command center was thick enough to choke on. Kane watched the monitors, his arms crossed, a knot of cold dread in his stomach. Solara stood beside him, her posture rigid, a queen made of gilded steel. The fake convoy, an empty armored transport, pulled out into the city streets. Minutes later, the comms crackled to life. "Ambush! Ground-level route is hot! Syndicate forces engaged!" The trap had sprung. The traitor was the logistics officer. They moved to apprehend him, Solara's guards flanking them as they swept toward the logistics hub. But as they rounded the final corner, they stopped dead. The logistics officer was on the floor, unconscious. Standing over him, a pulse pistol leveled at them, was Captain Thane. "I'm surprised it took you this long, Mercenary," Thane said, his voice stripped of all its prior professionalism. leaving only cold, hard contempt. The trap wasn't for the syndicate, it was for you. Solara stared, her face a mask of disbelief. Thane? Why? His face twisted in a snarl of pure agony. Why? Because this peace is a lie. It's a pact signed in the blood of our families and sealed with the silence of corrupt politicians. His gaze flickered between them, burning with a zealot's fire. You lost your mate, Ambassador. He lost his unit. He jabbed the pistol toward Kane. I lost everyone, my mate, my children. They were incinerated in a peacekeeping strike on Silos, a strike ordered by a Terran commander this treaty gives a full pardon to. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. The syndicate didn't offer me credits. They offered me justice. All I had to do was deliver the one thing that would burn this whole charade to the ground. Before they could react, Thane slammed his palm onto a red emergency panel on the wall. A piercing siren shrieked through the compound. Red lights strobed across the corridor as heavy blast doors thundered down, sealing the exits, turning the diplomatic sanctuary into a steel tomb. Riva's location is confirmed, Thane spoke into his wristcom. Syndicate teams, you are cleared to breach. Go! Kane roared at Solara, shoving her back toward the residential wing. Get Riva to the panic room, now! As Solara and her guards scrambled to evacuate the child, Thane's loyalists, Solarian soldiers who shared his grief, rounded the corner, rifles raised. Kane met them head-on, but his real target was Thane. He crashed into the captain, sending them both tumbling to the floor. It wasn't a firefight, it was a brawl. A brutal, desperate clash between two soldiers betrayed by the same war. Thane fought with the disciplined rage of a man with nothing left to lose, but Kane fought with the feral strength of a man who had just found everything. Kane's breath came in ragged, burning gasps. A white-hot agony flared in his side where one of Thane's blows had connected, and he was sure at least 2 ribs were cracked. He staggered to his feet, leaving the unconscious captain on the cold floor. The compound was screaming. Alarms blared in a ceaseless, maddening shriek, punctuated by the rhythmic thump of military-grade ordnance striking the outer walls. The lights flickered, casting the corridors in a strobe of red alert and sudden darkness. Solara was there, her face pale but her eyes blazing with command authority. Riva was clutched tightly in her arms, her small face buried in her mother's shoulder. Behind them, 2 of her royal guards laid down suppressing fire, but the scream of tearing metal from the main gates told Kane everything he needed to know. They weren't holding the line, they were buying seconds. We're pinned down, Solara said, her voice cutting through the din. We're not getting out through the city. They'll have every exit locked down. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not panic, but a desperate, calculating intelligence. There's another way. The old sub-level maintenance tunnels. They run for kilometers under the city and vent out into the deep desert. The desert. The place where this all began. No water, no transport, no shelter. It was a death sentence. But as another explosion rocked the foundation, showering them with dust from the ceiling, Kane knew she was right. It was the one place the syndicate wouldn't expect them to run. It was their only chance. He nodded, the simple motion sending a jolt of pain through his body. It's our best shot. Get what you can carry. Water, med kits, energy packs, nothing else. The guards covered their retreat as they plunged deeper into the residential wing. The sounds of battle grew more intense behind them, a symphony of destruction marking the fall of the compound. They grabbed 2 emergency packs, Kane slinging one over his good shoulder, a guard taking the other. Solara never let go of Riva. A hidden panel in a utility closet hissed open, revealing a dark, descending ladder. The air that rose from it was stale, thick with the scent of ozone and cold dust. One by one, they descended into the blackness, the roar of the fight fading above them, replaced by the echoing drip of unseen water and their own harsh breathing. Hours later, they emerged. A rusted hatch groaned open, and the icy wind of the Aritis night cut at their faces. Behind them on the horizon, the diplomatic compound was no longer a sanctuary of light, but a pillar of fire and black smoke against the star-dusted sky. They had escaped, but they were stranded. Solara pulled a small silver disc from her uniform. With trembling fingers, she activated it, sending a final encrypted distress signal toward the heavens. Solarian High Command has my message, she whispered, her voice raw. But the nearest fleet, they're days away. If they get it at all. Kane scanned the alien landscape, the twin moons casting long, skeletal shadows across the endless dunes. They were a tiny, desperate flicker of life in an ocean of sand. They had survived the betrayal. Now they had to survive the desert. Again. But this time, they weren't alone. And somewhere out in the darkness, the hunters were already closing in. The desert was a different kind of killer at night. The oppressive heat gave way to a biting cold that seeped into their bones, carried on a wind that scoured the dunes with whispers of sand. Kane pushed forward, every step a negotiation with a screaming pain in his ribs. He was the engine of their survival. His ranger training, buried for years under a mountain of cynicism, was now all that stood between them and oblivion. He led them by the patterns of the twin moons and alien constellations, his mind a map of forgotten lore. He taught them to dig condensation traps with salvaged tarp fragments, yielding precious metallic-tasting drops of water by dawn. He found shelter not in comfort, but in survival, a shallow overhang of black rock that broke the wind and hid them from the open sky. The two royal guards, loyal to the last, were fading. One had a nasty gash on his leg that was becoming infected. The other was succumbing to exhaustion, his movements slow and clumsy. They huddled together in the rock shelter, the guards taking the first watch. Riva was asleep, curled between a supply pack and her mother's side, a picture of impossible innocence in this desolate wasteland. Solara moved to Kane's side, her expression etched with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle. She opened a med kit. "Let me see," she said, her voice a low murmur. He didn't protest, just gritted his teeth as he peeled back the torn fabric of his shirt. The bruising across his torso was a violent galaxy of purple and black. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firm as she cleaned the lacerations. Her fingers, radiating that unique Solarian warmth, were like small suns against his cold skin, chasing away the chill but stoking a different kind of fire. "I'm terrified," she confessed, her voice cracking for the first time. She wasn't looking at his wounds anymore, but into his eyes. "When we were in the compound, I was an ambassador. I gave orders. Out here, I'm just a mother, and I'm terrified of losing her. And you." The admission hung in the cold air, fragile and real. "I let you both into my heart, Kane, despite all the risk." He reached up, his hand covering hers where it rested on his chest. He felt the steady, warm pulse of her life against his palm. The guilt he'd carried for years, the ghost of his dead unit, had always told him to run from this. But he wasn't running anymore. "For 10 years I've just been surviving," he admitted, his voice rough. "Fighting for the next meal, the next day. It was all I had left. But out here with you, I'm not just surviving anymore. I found what I lost in that ambush. A reason to fight that isn't about me. It's about love, about family." The space between them collapsed. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their kiss was desperate, a raw collision of chapped lips and shared breath under the light of the twin moons. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was a confirmation, a staking of a claim against the vast, empty darkness. He felt the incredible heat of her skin, a current of pure life flowing into him, a stark contrast to his own human warmth. It was everything. A small sound made them break apart. Riva had stirred, her eyes open and luminous in the moonlight. She wasn't scared. A slow, sleepy smile spread across her face. "I knew," she whispered, before closing her eyes and snuggling deeper into her makeshift bed. The moment of peace was perfect, a fragile bubble of hope in a sea of despair. Kane looked from Riva to Solara, a feeling of rightness settling in his soul for the first time in a decade. Then on the distant horizon, a flicker, then another, small dark shapes moving with unnatural speed and purpose against the stars, tracking drones. Their bubble of peace shattered, and the cold reality of the hunt returned with a vengeance. The drones were methodical, heartless. They carved the desert into a grid, their search patterns a tightening noose, Kane watched them through his macro binoculars, a cold certainty settling in his gut. They couldn't outrun this. They could only outthink it. "This way," he commanded, his voice a low rasp. "Run!" He led them not away but towards a jagged scar on the horizon, a line of rusted metal and crumbling rock crete half swallowed by the dunes. It was an old KG mining outpost, abandoned for decades. A tomb, or a fortress. He'd make it a fortress. Inside, the air was stale with the ghosts of industry. Kane's mind, once a mercenary's ledger, was now a ranger's battlefield map. "Here!" He pointed to a rusted console. "The primary ventilation shaft leads to a sub-level maintenance chamber. Riva, you go with the ambassador. Stay there. Do not make a sound." Solara armed herself with a pulse rifle from one of the guards, her movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. She was an ambassador no longer. She was a warrior mother defending her young. The two guards, grim-faced and resolute, took up positions on a rickety gantry, their rifles covering the main entrance. Kane worked with desperate speed. He found old seismic charges, their power cells long dead, but their explosive cores still viable. With stripped wiring and a detonator rigged from a power conduit, he turned the outpost into a death trap. He identified load-bearing supports, weakened by time, and placed charges that would bring tons of rock and steel down on anyone foolish enough to enter the wrong corridor. They didn't have to wait long. Syndicate ground transport screamed to a halt outside, kicking up plumes of red dust. Figures in black armor fanned out, their discipline military, not mercenary. Leading them was a Solarian, his crystalline skin a dark, menacing obsidian. Through his scope, Kane saw the cruel smirk on the commander's face. This wasn't politics for him. This was a payday. The assault was brutal and direct. The first squad stormed the main entrance. The guards opened fire, their pulse rounds punching through armor, but they were outnumbered 10-1. As the syndicate troops pushed forward, Kane hit the detonator. A deafening roar shook the outpost as a section of the ceiling collapsed, burying half the squad under a mountain of twisted metal. The enemy commander, Vex, was undeterred. He split his forces, sending them through side tunnels. Kane's second trap went off, an improvised explosive that turned a narrow passage into a superheated kill zone. But they kept coming. A stray shot caught the first guard, sending him plummeting from the gantry. The second guard grunted, a dark stain spreading across his chest, but he stayed on his rifle, providing covering fire until his breath gave out and he slumped over the railing. They were alone. Plasma bolts shrieked past Kane's head, melting holes in the bulkhead behind him. He returned fire, his movements economical and deadly. He felt, more than saw, Solara take up a position at his 6. A syndicate soldier flanked him and was dropped by a precise shot from her rifle. Kane spun, taking out another who was aiming for her. They moved like a single organism, a dance of death in the echoing halls of the mine. A nod, a hand signal, the shared understanding of two people fighting for the same sacred purpose. They fell back corridor by corridor, a fighting retreat towards the maintenance shaft, towards Riva. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood and plasma. They were the wall, they were the fire, and they would not let the syndicate pass. The fighting died down, replaced by an unnerving silence. Then a new sound, a single set of heavy rhythmic footsteps echoing down the main corridor. Vex. He was done sending pawns. He was coming for Reva himself. Kane pushed himself off the bulkhead, ribs screaming in protest. He intercepted the obsidian-skinned Solarian in a narrow service tunnel, the walls so close their shoulders could almost brush them. There was no room for tactics, no space for ranged combat. This would be decided by steel and will. Vex smiled, a predator's grin. The washed-up ranger, still trying to save the children you let die the first time? He lunged, his movements unnaturally fast. A combat knife, humming with a low-energy field, sliced through the air. Kane parried, the impact jarring his arm to the shoulder. Vex was stronger, his limbs augmented with microservos that whined with every powerful thrust. He drove Kane back, blade on blade, the screech of metal filling the claustrophobic space. "The syndicate pays well for failure," Vex taunted, his knee slamming into Kane's cracked ribs. but they pay even better for results. Pain exploded behind Kane's eyes. He staggered, his vision blurring. Vex's words cut deeper than his knife, twisting the old guilt into fresh agony. But then, through the haze of pain, he saw an image. Riva's face, terrified in the dark. Solara's, fierce and trusting. This wasn't about his past failures. It was about their future. A switch flipped. The pain became fuel. The guilt became rage. This wasn't a soldier fighting an enemy. This was a father protecting his family. Vex lunged again, aiming for Kane's throat. Instead of parrying, Kane turned his body, letting the blade sink deep into the flesh of his side. He roared, not in pain, but in triumph. The move was a desperate gamble, a sacrifice. It bought him 1 second. It was all he needed. With Vex's arm committed, Kane drove his own blade upward, a brutal upward thrust from the gut. The hardened steel punched through Vex's armor and sank into his neck. The humming of the augmentation sputtered and died. Vex's eyes went wide with shock, his mouth opening in a silent gasp before he collapsed. Lifeless. The silence that followed was absolute. Kane slumped against the tunnel wall, his hand pressed against the gushing wound in his side, his own blood hot and slick on his fingers. Footsteps, light and urgent, rounded the corner. It was Solara. In her hand wasn't a weapon, but Vex's comm unit, a stream of data scrolling across its screen. "I have it, Kane," she breathed, her voice tight with victory and terror. The entire command structure, their political contacts, everything. He tried to nod, to smile, but the strength was gone. The world tilted, the steel walls dissolving into a gray smear. His legs gave out and he fell. Solara caught him, cradling his head in her lap. Her face was a mask of anguish and profound love. A single crystalline tear detached from her eye and fell onto his cheek. It wasn't cold like ice, but warm, impossibly warm, like a drop of sunlight. From the shadows of the deeper chamber, a small figure emerged. Riva stood there, her eyes wide, taking in the scene. The dead commander, the blood, and her mother holding her desert guardian. Her family, broken and bleeding, but alive. Together. The desert sky, once empty and vast, was suddenly blotted out by impossible shadows. A low, ground-shaking roar built to a crescendo as the sleek, silver hulls of Solarian battlecruisers descended through the atmosphere, their running lights turning the night-shrouded dunes into a landscape of blue and white. The cavalry had arrived. Medtechs in sterile white armor swarmed the outpost, their movements a blur of professional urgency. They stabilized the wounded guard first, then moved to Kane. He felt the cold spray of a biofoam sealant on his side, the prick of a needle in his neck. His vision swam, but through the haze he saw Solara standing firm, a commander amidst the chaos. She handed Vex's comm unit to a communications officer, her voice ringing with an authority that cut through the noise. "Transmit this on all high-priority channels. Encrypt it for High Command and the Terran Embassy. The truth is on this device." Days blurred into a series of waking moments in a sterile white medical bay. The pain was a dull, managed throb, but the world came to him through the large holoscreen on the wall. It was a cascade of revelations. News reports with screaming headlines. Obsidian Syndicate leadership arrested. War profiteering conspiracy exposed. Solarian human accords back on track. One report caught his full attention. It showed a haggard Captain Thane being led in binders, his face a mask of grim acceptance. The announcer's voice was somber. "Thane's testimony has implicated officials at the highest levels of both governments, revealing a decade-long cover-up of war crimes during the Viridian conflict, specifically the ambush of Terran Ranger Unit 73. Kane's breath caught in his throat. A picture of his old unit flashed on screen. Young men, smiling, alive. "The newly declassified records prove," the announcer continued, "that the unit was deliberately sacrificed to protect illicit syndicate operations. Sole survivor, Sergeant Kane Walker, previously charged with desertion, has been exonerated. His actions, which resulted in saving 3 civilian children at the cost of his unit, have been reclassified as heroic. He is to be awarded the Terran Medal of Valor, posthumously for his squad and in person for him. The words didn't land with a crash, but with a profound, earth-shattering silence. The weight he had carried for years, the guilt, the shame, the ghost of his commander's accusation, it didn't just lift. It evaporated. It had never truly been his to carry. The broadcast cut to a live feed of Solara, standing before a joint session of the new diplomatic council, Riva holding her hand. Her voice was strong, filled with a leader's fire, but softened by a mother's heart. This accord is not about forgetting the past, she declared, her gaze sweeping across the chamber. It is about choosing a future built not on political maneuvering, but on the simple, undeniable acts of compassion that bind all sentient beings. It is built on the choice one man made in the desert, to give his last drop of water to a dying child he did not know, asking for nothing in return. Kane watched, his throat tight, the bandages around his ribs feeling less like a restraint and more like an embrace. He didn't need to hear his name. He was no longer a mercenary running from his past or a soldier disgraced by lies. He was the man who gave his last canteen. He leaned his head back against the pillow, the hum of the medical monitors a steady rhythm. For the first time in a decade, the silence in his own mind was not empty. It was peaceful. 6 months later, the formal attire of the Hegemony Diplomatic Corps felt stiff and unnatural, the high collar a far cry from the worn fatigues he was used to. But as Kane stood on the grand observation deck of the Capitol spire, he felt a sense of pride that was anything but uncomfortable. He was no longer a mercenary or a disgraced soldier. He was the official human liaison to the Solarian Diplomatic Corps and the newly appointed chief of security for Ambassador Solara's household. But those were just titles. His real position was here at her side. A small hand slipped into his. He looked down to see Riva, her crystalline skin now smooth and radiant, glowing with health. She looked up at him, her eyes bright, and made a complex series of hand signs. "The stars are happy today, Papa Kane." He smiled, his own fingers clumsily mirroring the gesture. "Yes, they are." Solara joined them, placing a hand on the small of his back. Her touch was a constant, familiar warmth that had become his anchor. She was his partner, their bond acknowledged publicly in a ceremony that blended the traditions of both their peoples, a symbol of the very future they had fought for. Together, the three of them looked out over the sprawling city below. On the pristine avenues, humans and Solarians walked side by side, their children playing together in the public gardens. The peace they had bled for wasn't just a document. It was real, alive, and breathing in the city below. Solara's fingers intertwined with his. "I still think about that day," she said softly, her voice for him alone. "In the desert. You had nothing, and you gave everything for a stranger." Kane looked from her face to Riva's, and then out at the horizon. He thought of the man he had been, bleeding, alone, running from a life that had already ended. He had thought the desert was his grave. He was wrong. "The desert didn't take my life," he said, his voice thick with a truth that settled deep in his bones. "It gave me one." The final image is not of them. It's of a small, quiet room, filled with starlight from a window. On a polished shelf, next to a child's treasured toys, sits an old dented metal canteen. It's scuffed and worn, a relic of a desperate moment. But in the soft glow of the twin moons, it shines like a monument, a silent testament that one single act of compassion, offered without hesitation, can change the fate of worlds.